is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition, with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in Westminster. Now, we look at the politics, and this is what's coming up on today's program. Edging towards number 10, UK bonds surge at the open after Rishi Sunak steps closer to becoming Britain's next Prime Minister as Boris Johnson bows out of the race. European stocks extend gains as investors brace for a busy week of earnings and monitor updates from the UK leadership race. And finally, we look at China. Total control. Chinese markets tumble despite GDP topping estimates after President Xi Jinping secures a third term in office, filling the party's leadership with allies. Now we're getting a bit of breaking news. Euro area October manufacturing PMI coming in lower than expected, 46.6. We had a 47.9 forecast. A reminder, anything below 50 is still a contraction. Euro area October services PMI also falling to the forecast, 48.2%. So we'll have a look at what that means. There was a brilliant, actually, blog entry from our Venram saying, look, unless these PMIs are really ugly, which frankly they haven't been because they're pretty much in line with expectations, then the ECB, he thinks, is on course to deliver a 75 basis point hike on Thursday. Now, let's focus on Westminster. Rishi Sunak has taken a step towards becoming the UK's next Prime Minister after his former boss, Boris Johnson, pulled out of the contest. Well, that leaves Penny Mordaunt as the only possible opponent in the race to succeed Liz Truss. Joining us now is Bloomberg's UK government reporter. He's Joe Mays. Joe, great to have you on the program today. Look, we're 9 o'clock UK time on the dot, and it doesn't look like Penny Mordaunt has the 100 MPs required for her support to go through to the second round. Could that change?
It might change. She only has, say, 30 public backers now, and the only way she could get to 100 is if those Boris Johnson supporters en masse went across to her. But the problem we're seeing for her is that some of them publicly are coming out for Rishi Sunak. So we're seeing kind of seepage, effectively, to the Sunak campaign, and Mordaunt can't have that. So it's not looking great for her, but, you know, who knows? It's a private process right now, so she could get over the line, but it looks unlikely right now.
So how many does Rishi Sunak have now? About 155?
More than 150, yes.
And that number's just going up?
It is going up, yes, exactly.
So if Penny Mordaunt does have 100, then it goes to the base, the Conservative membership. Is it all to play?
Yeah, so there'll be an indicative vote tonight where MPs express a preference, and you'd expect Rishi Sunak to win that vote, probably. But then, like you say, it would go to the Conservative Party membership, where Mordaunt is perhaps more popular. So there is still a chance that she becomes Prime Minister. So the key thing to watch out for is today, 2 p.m, does Mordaunt make it onto the ballot? Or indeed, this morning, does she concede to Rishi Sunak because she hasn't reached 100 nominations?
Joe, what do we know about the policies, actually, of Rishi Sunak? I know we know maybe a lot more than others because he campaigned just 2 months ago, but actually a lot happened in the last 2 months.
Yes, so I think Rishi's policies are fiscal conservatism, and that would likely be mirrored with what Jeremy Hunt's been offering as Chancellor. So you could expect kind of number 10 and the Treasury to be really in lockstep on fiscal policy in a way that perhaps they weren't in the last days of Truss, where Jeremy Hunt effectively junked her economic plan. So Rishi, we know, fiscal conservatism, try and bring inflation down. Those are his kind of headline policies.
I mean, if you look at the media pundits, everyone's asking what happens to the Conservative Party now. I mean, does it really matter what happens to the Conservative Party? If you have one person in power for the next 2 years, does he need to govern for the country?
Well, I think that Rishi's first job will be to try and bring that party together, because the Conservative Party can't have what it's had in the last couple of weeks with open division, rancour. It looks terrible to the public. So unite the party, and then, yes, like you say, he has a 2-year window in which he can try to turn the country around and be in a position where you go into that next general election with a good perspectives to the country. That will be his aim, for sure.
Okay, Joe, thank you so much. Joe Mays there, looking, of course, at some of the politics here in the UK. Now let's get straight to the markets. The Prime Minister Liz Truss on her way out. The huge economic and fiscal headwinds ahead spell further pain for the pound, regardless of who wins the contest to become the UK's next leader. Well, here to unpack all of it is Jane Foley, head of FX strategy at Rabobank. Jane, as always, thank you so much for joining us. So what happens to the pound now?
Well, you know, the pound, if you like, has certainly been supported by the news that Boris will not be standing again. I mean, Boris acknowledged that it would be quite divisive for the party. And of course, the markets have a preference for Sunak. He's well known to them as a chancellor. His concerns over the summer about Liz Truss's policies really did prove correct. So the markets understand that we really do need someone in here, who will tighten the strings fiscally. And that seems like he's going to do. And that together with Hunt is the best outcome, I think, for the markets. But, we've got to acknowledge that UK fundamentals were pretty weak all year. They were pretty weak ahead of the September the 23rd mini budget, and they're still weak now. So there are still headwinds, certainly for sterling, even if it appears that we might be a step closer to a better outlook from the fiscal policy.
So, Jane, what exactly is being priced in on the fiscal side right now? If it's Rishi Sunak, is there an assumption in the markets that he keeps the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, and that actually nothing changes, and we could even have the fiscal plan on Monday?
I think there is that assumption there. I mean, I think it's got to be said that probably the same would have to be said about Penny Mordaunt and Rishi. They'd understand the turmoil that we've seen over the last few weeks, and probably understand the turmoil attached with replacing Chancellor Hunt with another Chancellor would just add to that. So I would imagine that Chancellor Hunt will be confirmed. It's a shame that neither candidate has confirmed that already. But assuming that is confirmed, then certainly that brings some degree of calm. Now, if we were to have both names go ahead in the ballots out to the Conservative Party members throughout the country, i.e. if Mordaunt and Sunak were both on that ballot, that would certainly bring some more uncertainty back to the markets. We wouldn't know who the Prime Minister would be until the end of the week, and that would raise the chances that the membership vote for Penny Mordaunt, which it would not be the most market-friendly candidate. But if we do get Sunak today being assured as the Prime Minister, I think there's probably a little bit of more scope here for sterling to potentially rally. But then, of course, it would just face the real reality, whereas there's a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah, I was going to say nothing really changes actually for what the Bank of England needs to do. So what are the options for the central bank?
Well, I think everyone assumes that the bank will be hiking interest rates again aggressively to keep a lid on inflation. But the good thing is that, assuming that we have Sunak, assuming that we have Hunt remaining as a Chancellor, it means that the government will be working in lockstep with the Bank of England. That is not what we had, of course, under Truss. Truss was putting demand back into the economy through tax cuts. At the time when the Bank of England was taking demand out through tighter monetary policy. So already we've seen rates shift a bit lower today. So yes, the Bank of England clearly will be hiking interest rates quite aggressively, but not as much as they would have had to do if we'd have had Truss's policies adding that demand back in. So yeah, interest rate hikes, yes, but not as much as they would have been otherwise. And we've already seen the market react to that this morning.
Jane, there was quite a lot of news, of course, over the weekend from the China People's Congress, and that sent shockwaves on markets. I don't know whether you look at that through a U.S. strength point of view or whether you'd rather focus on renminbi.
Well, certainly, that the renminbi has seen a big setback. I mean, in terms of its outlook, if we look at the data that we had, for instance, this morning from China, we had the GDP a little bit better than expected, but certainly if you look at the retail sales, there's certain weakness there. And I think what's really, hanging around the outlook for the renminbi and certainly investor sentiment for China is the continuation of zero COVID and what that could mean for growth in the months ahead. So there's that factor combined with the political concerns related to the toughness now of Xi's, the fact that he's been put back in power again for a third time, and the fact that he really has consolidated the power behind him. So we have a very strong one-man leadership in China too, and that is certainly very worrying. But if we look at Hong Kong shares this morning, I think we get a taste of the market's concerns about not just the politics but also the economics in China right now, and they're certainly not looking good.
Jane, thanks so much. Jane Foley there, head of FX strategy at Rabobank, stays with us. We'll talk a lot more about China and, of course, dollar. Coming up, the future of China now lies in the hands of Xi Jinping and his all-male inner circle of proven loyalists. More on what this means for the world's second largest economy. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg. economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. We're at Westminster, and of course we also look at a broader field with China and Italy. Now, Chinese markets tumbled after President Xi Jinping tightened his grip on power. Now, it comes after the Chinese leader actually filled the country's most powerful agencies with his close allies, while also securing an unprecedented third consecutive term, the close of the party congress in Beijing. Now, let's speak now to Bloomberg's Asian government and politics correspondent, Rebecca Chun-Wilkins. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. So what does the new lineup tell us about Xi and China's direction going forward?
Well, we've really seen Xi Jinping looking to consolidate and concentrate his power in the upper echelons of China's Communist Party, even more than we had, and many had predicted, in fact. 4 out of the 5 members of China's Supreme Leadership Group, that's the Politburo Standing Committee, are Xi Jinping's protege. The 6th man, and it is all men, is one of his close allies. And some of the exits from both the Politburo and that Standing Committee have also surprised and reinforced the idea that loyalty has been a key deciding factor when it comes to choosing who will take these top leadership positions, essentially paving the way for a group of politicians who will look to dedicate themselves to implementing Xi Jinping's policy. He has effectively ruled out any effective form of dissension or pushback. There is a question and a concern that there could be policy missteps without these types of sort of checks and balances, even within such a tightly controlled political group like the Standing Committee.
Rebecca, how are the markets reacting?
Well, we've seen quite a brutal day across Chinese asset classes. In fact, today, 8 shares and China shares that are traded in Hong Kong have fallen to their worst since 2008. The currency has also weakened onshore to its worst since the global financial crisis. Chinese corporate offshore junk bonds are at a record low. So it is quite a sort of resounding sense of pessimism here. Really, I think, off this idea that as Xi Jinping tightens his grip on power, there is less likelihood and less room that there will be a move away from some of the most punishing policies on the economy so far. So that is COVID zero, which has really dragged on economic growth, as well as the property crackdown too. And this emphasis on sort of socialism with Chinese characteristics driving the market going forward, and along with common prosperity, doubling down this idea that actually ultimately policy is increasingly going to be driven along ideological lines. It's going to be increasingly dominated by the state, and that's propelling that pessimism for many investors, particularly for international investors, now looking at what the next 5 years of China holds for them.
Yep. Thank you so much, Bloomberg's Asian government and politics correspondent, Rebecca Chun-Wilkins. Now, we'll have plenty more, of course, on China. We're back with Jane Foley, head of FX strategy at Rabobank. Jane, we talked a little bit about renminbi. Overall, what does this mean for the world economy?
Well, certainly, as long as we've got the zero COVID in place, I think the world economy, as we've become to expect, has really been constrained by that. But of course, the political constraints are something that the market is also getting used to, and that is China being driven less by consensus and more by just one man, and that is something which could have long-term implications, and certainly is something which will just create this sense that's been building all year amongst investors of doubt in the outlook for the Chinese economy over the next 5 or so years.
So, Jane, where are you expecting overall for sterling to? I mean, actually, I was going to ask about dollar, but I don't know whether there's also sterling, because all of the concerns on sterling could be exacerbated by what's going on around the world.
I think you're right, and I think to some extent it's the other way around as well. You know, what we've seen in the UK, what we've seen in terms of politics could also be mirrored, perhaps to a lesser extent, in other economies. So, for instance, we've seen the Liz Truss experiment of trying to promote growth through fiscal support coming at a really bad time, because, of course, it operates against what central banks are doing. Now, you could potentially say, well, what about what's happening in Germany in terms of the fiscal support that's coming again there, being counter to what the ECB is doing. Now, clearly, there is nothing like the sort of scale, and as it stands right now, Europe does have a current account surplus. So the region is not as exposed by the UK, but certainly I think there are many economies around the world, many governments, which will be taking some lessons really about the importance of fiscal prudence in this environment.
Jane, overall, are you expecting the U.S. economy to actually hold up? So we've seen it in the bank earnings that, consumer spending has been able to stay pretty strong. Does it fall off the cliff into next year?
Yeah, I'm fairly pessimistic, to be honest. I mean, certainly for some economies, depending which ones, there's more lasting support from some of the COVID savings. But I think, if we look on ahead to next year, that will be eroded. The impact of inflation on household finances will be a lot more marked. And I think if we look at consumer confidence numbers and a whole variety of economies, we see them really having weakened quite significantly. I mean, the Eurozone, certainly the UK, even if we look at the PMIs that we've seen this morning, I think these are worrying numbers. We're talking about contraction. We're talking about the possibility that the UK may already be in recession. If we look at the PMI for Germany this morning, then perhaps we're talking about the inevitability of a German recession. So I think as we move into next year, I think we're going to fall across, some pretty tough times for an awful lot of people.
All right, Jane, thank you so much. Jane Foley there, head of FX strategy at Rabobank, joining us in some of the calls in currency markets. Now, coming up, we'll have plenty more, of course, from Westminster, also trying to get over the line. Challenger Penny Mordaunt has just a few hours to gather enough support. Otherwise, Rishi Sunak set to become the next prime minister. So we'll talk about that shortly. This is Bloomberg.
Season is here.
The earnings are starting to pour in.
The numbers are holding up better than expected.
Sorry, business isn't all that bad.
Bloomberg breaks the numbers first.
Netflix earnings going to cross the wire.
A big beat.
The stock is up more than 8%.
Coming in stronger than their rivals.
With exclusive expert analysis.
Finally back to growth.
The mother of all opportunities.
What is the industry to watch?
That's where the rubber hits the road for Goldman Sachs.
It's going to be a really interesting earnings season.
Bloomberg Television and Radio. The fastest numbers and analysis you trust.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here at Westminster. Now, the focus, of course, on all things politics, but also let's get straight to your Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. Russia's defence ministers called counterparts in the UK, France and Turkey, warning of a drift towards uncontrolled escalation in Ukraine and the potential for Kyiv to detonate a radioactive dirty bomb. Ukraine has consistently denied any such move and says Russia often accuses others of what they do plan themselves. The US called the allegation transparently false. Now, Giorgia Meloni has been sworn in as Italy's new prime minister, becoming the country's first female leader and heading its most right-wing government since World War II. Meloni must steer the euro area's third biggest economy through an energy crisis compounded by rising interest rates and also slowing growth. She will address both houses of parliament this week for a confirmatory confidence vote. Australia's Treasurer Jim Chambers says he saved an unexpected windfall in commodity prices rather than risk spending it and adding to inflation. Chambers will unveil his first budget on Tuesday night, where he'll balance delivering on Labour's spending promises from their May election win with a worsening economic outlook.
The slowing of the Chinese economy and their approach to zero COVID does have consequences for our economy, and you'll see that in our own budget forecasts. Not a revolution in how they go about that, but a bit of a rethink about making sure our markets are diverse. And so I work very closely with our big employers and our big exporters to make sure that they've got the mix right. China is an important economic partner. There's no use pretending otherwise.
Now, Shell is investing in Qatar's latest natural gas project with a 9% stake in the North Field South expansion. The project is part of the Gulf nation's efforts to boost capacity amid a global surge in gas demand. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has sent European nations on a frantic search for alternative sources to Russia. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Leanne, thanks so much. Coming up, Rishi Sunak has taken a huge step towards becoming the UK's next Prime Minister after his former boss, Boris Johnson, pulls out. We'll bring you the latest from the UK and Westminster next. This is Bloomberg.
No, sorry, I need to turn down.
Edging towards number 10, UK bonds surge at the open after Rishi Sunak steps closer to becoming Britain's next Prime Minister as Boris Johnson bows out of the race. European stocks extend gains as investors brace for a busy week of earnings and monitor updates from the leadership race here in the UK. And finally, total control. Chinese markets tumbled despite GDP topping estimates after President Xi Jinping secures a third term in office, filling the party's leadership with allies. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, actually in Westminster, covering all of the machinations and the comings and goings over the weekend. Now, Rishi Sunak has taken a huge steps forward towards becoming the UK's next Prime Minister after his former boss, Boris Johnson, pulled out of the contest. That leaves Penny Mordaunt as the only possible opponent in the race to succeed Liz Truss. So, with the very latest on politics, I'm delighted to be joined by Bloomberg's executive editor for international government, Ros Matheson, and then we'll go to Robin Niblett of Chatham House. So, Ros, is it almost a certain win for Rishi Sunak, or can Penny Mordaunt still get the 100 MPs in the next 4 hours?
Well, that's the big question, because certainly momentum is very much with Rishi Sunak at this point. He's got a lot of endorsements coming out, even again this morning, senior figures in the Tory party saying they're rallying behind him to become the next leader. Penny Mordaunt, of course, is yet to say what her decision is. As of last night, she said that she was still in the race. She said she was confident of getting 100 Tory lawmakers, which is what she needs to actually get on the ballot for leader. The question is how many of those who were supporting Boris Johnson will now shift behind her. Will she get enough to get over the line? At this stage, it looks unlikely. And the question is, does she drop out of the race ahead of time, or does she try and force it to a vote of Tory lawmakers later tonight?
So, Raza, is there any, I mean, you know, we're talking about secret agreements, and then this, we understand, it really came to fruition. Is there any understanding that if she gets the 100 but is very far behind Rishi, she doesn't go through, or does it definitely go to Tory membership?
Well, certainly there's a lot of backroom conversations going on again today about how they can stave off a damaging potential further escalation of this leadership ballot, which is already coming on top of turmoil that's afflicted UK politics for weeks, if not months. And there would have to be some conversation about the fact that if she only gets just to 100 lawmakers, should she really go forward at that point and insist on a ballot in Parliament later today, or should she step aside? Perhaps there might be conversations going on about an alternate role for her in a Sunak administration, for example. Can he bring in a unity government and all those people who might have been contesting the leadership now have a role in his administration, for example? No. You can imagine those chats are going on ahead of time today.
Ros, thank you so much. Ros Matheson there, our executive editor for international government. So we're staying here, of course, at Westminster. We're joined by Sir Robin Niblett. He's Distinguished Fellow at Chatham House. Robin, as always, thank you so much for joining us. I don't know what we would expect, or what you would expect, you know, a premiership with Rishi Sunak to look like.
Well, some of the language that's been used about him, that he's used about himself, competence, patience. One thing we know is he'd be in line with where the markets would like the UK to do. You'd have a Chancellor rowing with the Bank of England as opposed to against the Bank of England. I think he would hope even to get a little bit of a bounce economically. The debt might drop, therefore some of the extra delta that's been increased on the markets and the cost of British debt might drop and help a little bit with the numbers. I think he's going to try and build, obviously, a unified cabinet.
Will that work? I mean, not cabinet, but actually the party, because he needs the party to get things through Parliament.
100%. Look, I think it's a half and half. I mean, the majority realistically now is more like 70. That means only 35 have to vote against you for you not to be able to get legislation through. 70 could abstain and you would be able to get legislation through. My sense is there's a good 25 to 30 Rishi haters. I think of the 60 or so who were meant to be in favour of Boris Johnson, half of them at least would move over and come in behind Rishi Sunak. And you've had already this morning Nadeem Zahawi, Priti Patel, some of the people on that side saying, look, let's unite behind. But there are some, Nadine Dorry's kind of wing of the party, that I think would never accept it. Is that enough to block him? I don't think so. I think, you know, the party is going to lose dreadfully in 2024 if they don't row in behind him. They'll probably lose in any case, even if they row behind him. But they've got to be looking ahead, some of them even to 2029.
Is there a chance, Robin, of having a general election before? Or actually, is he, if he becomes Prime Minister, is he in charge for 2 years?
There's a chance. Look, my gut is Labour obviously will fight this hard for the right for a general election. Would they want to take over the country right now from a practical standpoint? Is it better for them to let him take the tough decisions for the next 2 years? Probably yes. Rishi himself thinks he can do a John Major in 1992, you know, after the overthrow of Maggie Thatcher. Despite all the odds, he beat Neil Kinnock in that amazing election. They still lost after that, of course, and badly for a long time to Tony Blair. So I think Rishi Sunak thinks that there's still some doubts about Labour. They don't have the Scottish, SNP are against them now. So Labour is not, as strong. There's still a Corbyn memory. I think he thinks he's got something to fight for, and the party do as well.
I'm hearing so much about party politics. I mean, we're going through a huge inflation crisis. We're going through, of course, a huge cost of living crisis. Like, what does the country need? What, does he, become Prime Minister to this country, and so tries to do better so that each and everyone has a chance? Yeah,
but the problem is doing better right now is very difficult. It's how not to do too badly. Yeah, you've got 30 billion roughly pounds a year to fill, probably after all of the Jeremy Hunt ditching of Liz Truss's programme and Kwasi Kwarteng's programme. So whatever happens, departments are going to take really tough hits. The fact that Ben Wallace was with the Boris Johnson camp on defence, maybe they say that 3% target is later. He hasn't made the move over yet, but that's going to save you very little on the margins. It's really about cost savings and where. I may agree with you. It's going to be incredibly difficult, but they only have one choice, which is to try to get a budget through.
Do you think Rishi Sunak would, stick with the current Chancellor?
My gut would be yes. Nadeem Zahawi was on the wrong side and only jumped at the last minute. In a way, Jeremy Hunt has already laid out the Rishi Sunak programme. What you do not want is another tough person who's going to take him on in the Chancellor, in the number 11 Downing Street position, which is the traditional problem. So if you're going to run 2 years, you need an absolute loyalist doing the job that you proposed, which is what Jeremy Hunt does with Rishi Sunak.
I mean, what happens, actually, if we were to have an election tomorrow? It's also very likely that Tories are not the opposition, that we could see the SNP being the opposition. Where does this leave the state of UK politics?
This is another reason why they've got to hang him for 2 years from the Conservative standpoint, because if an election would be held today, it could be seismic. Yes, you could even have, as you said, Conservatives literally blown out of the water. With our first past the post system in the UK, it's winner takes all. Look, realistically, I think the push for Scottish independence rises, but that's still delayed. That has to be approved by Westminster. Again, I'm not sure that, that's wanted by Nicola Sturgeon right now. Everyone's trying to get as much as they can out of the chaos for a campaign, I think, in 2 years' time, not for a campaign in the next 6 months.
What kind of relationship would Rishi Sunak have with the EU? What kind of relationship would he have with the US? Look,
there's been some articles written, I would certainly be an advocate of it, that if you're going to try to get through this incredibly choppy time, you can't do it fighting the EU at the same time. Brexit adds a drag effect to the British economy. It knocks percentage point, or half a percentage point certainly, off British growth on an annual basis. So I think ideally he would bury the hatchet, not make big concessions. The problem is Suella Braverman's come in, he's got Stephen Baker, a lot of the people he brought in to do the big tent are the ones who are saying, oh, you won't back off on being tough on European Convention on Human Rights, which is not an EU thing. He was always pro-Brexit, but he's pro-Brexit, but somebody looking at those economic opportunities of deregulation, which you could still go through with. It's really about the Northern Ireland Protocol. Will he back off on that? Will he push the bill through? I would hope they don't. But this is one of my worry points, is that to hold the tent together, he's got to keep fighting the EU for 2 more years. And that'd be bad for the British economy.
Robin, thank you so much for joining us. Sir Robin Niblett, their distinguished fellow at Chatham House, joining us also on the foreign policy aspect to the new possible premier. Let's get straight to your Bloomberg Business Flash. Here's Leanne Gearens. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. Philips is to cut 4,000 jobs while it struggles with a costly recall of its sleep apnea treatment devices. Termination-related costs are expected to be about 300 million euros. The new CEO of the Dutch multinational, Roy Jacobs, says the company hasn't lived up to expectations. Now, delayed economic data from China showed a mixed recovery in the third quarter, with unemployment rising and retail sales weakening in September, despite a pickup of growth. GDP rose 3.9% in the quarter from a year ago, rebounding from almost stagnant growth in the previous period when Shanghai was still in a lockdown. China's home prices, meanwhile, sunk for a 13-month in September, with home sales and property investment also continuing to fall. Bloomberg has learned that Credit Suisse Chief Compliance Officer Rafael Lopez Lorenzo is set to leave in the coming weeks after little more than a year in the post. Sources say his departure is not related to the strategic review the Swiss bank is planning to announce this week. Lopez Lorenzo was part of a new crop of executives appointed in the wake of multiple scandals at the Swiss bank. Now, Shell is investing in Qatar's latest natural gas project with a 9% stake in the North Field South expansion. The project is part of the Gulf nation's efforts to boost capacity amid a global surge in gas demand. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has sent European nations on a frantic search for alternative sources to Russia. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Francine.
Leanne, thank you so much. Now let's go back, of course, to Westminster, where we've been all day. Joining us is Labour MP Emily Thornberry. Thank you so much for joining us. I know Labour believes it's time for a general election. Many in the public think it's time for a general election. But what will it take for you to get one?
Well, 70% of the public think there should be a general election, in fact. I think they think that because there's all this going on, this kind of Conservative Party psychodrama is going on. It really affects us. I mean, the last lot crashed the economy, you know, and they said they were going to help with bills, but all they've done is put up mortgages and are really frightening people. And they now say, oh, we need to have austerity Mark II. I mean, they weren't saying that a few months ago. Now they're saying it. And, you know, the public don't get a say in any of this. I mean, we're supposed to be a democracy. It's really very frustrating and very difficult.
I mean, political rules are political rules in terms of elections.
They're not rules. They're not rules. I mean, the fundamental rule is what's good. No, it's not a fixed-term parliament. No, because we got rid of the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, or they did. You know, they introduced it, then they got rid of it. Okay. So now it's up to MPs. It's up to the Prime Minister when we get an election. Right. But you know, if his or her MPs go and say we're not going to support you anymore, then you can have a general election.
You need about 40 of those MPs to basically not support them. Do you think that will happen before 2 years?
Well, a lot of them, right, were saying we are going to support Boris Johnson because he's the only one who has a democratic mandate. Do you remember? So they were saying because he led the party in 2019 when we got the general election, then he's the only one with a mandate, so we have to support him. No. Well, of course, now Boris Johnson's not standing. I would just ask those MPs, well, given he's no longer going to be your guy, who are you going to support? You can't support anybody with a democratic mandate. Do the right thing. You know, look after the country first, and then the party, and then yourself, and go for a general election.
So it looks like Rishi Sunak is the next Prime Minister. Do you think we'll be in a better path in terms of growth than when it was under Liz Truss?
It's difficult to imagine being worse off than being under Liz Truss, but, I mean, we're not as well off as we would be if the country were able to decide, and we're able to decide on a stable alternative. They're crying out for change. They don't want this anymore. They want a Labour government, and they're not being allowed to have it. And that's just wrong. And I find it difficult on a day like today to just kind of accept that there's going to be somebody who's essentially going to be crowned, without even a vote of their MPs, let alone of their members, let alone of the public. He hasn't even done a media round of coming around explaining what it is that he's going to do. So, we may assume he'll be better than Liz Truss, but we don't know what his policies are. I mean, he had a lot in the summer, but a lot's changed since then. So does he still stand by that or not? Nobody knows.
Is it better for Labour to just wait until the winter months come? So all of the, the inflation, it's going to be very tough for whoever's in power to actually put policies that put this country on a better path. Is it better to wait so that this gets done by someone else and then you stay in power for longer?
So we don't know how bad it is because the Office of Budget Responsibility hasn't been allowed to publish its reports. So we're going to see it a week on Monday. Then we'll see how bad it is. We don't even know yet. I think in the end, we need to be in power because we need to save the government. We need to save the country from this government. I mean, it's as stark as that. The longer they stay in, the more of a mess I think they're going to make of things, and the more difficult it'll be for us to sort it out afterwards.
Do you think Labour is now the party for business more than the Tory party, given what happened in the last 2 months?
I think that the Labour Party is the party of growth and stable economy, and so therefore that's what business wants. We've got this, Tesco's, which is obviously one of the big businesses here. Chair of Tesco says only Labour is on the pitch when it comes to having a plan for the growth of our economy. We are getting many businesses turning to us and realising that actually, although historically there may be prejudice in favour of the Conservative Party, look at the reality. The reality is they can't be trusted with the economy, and Labour can.
Emily, thank you so much for joining us. Emily Thornberry there, Labour MP. Now, we'll have plenty more, of course, throughout the day here from Westminster. Many people comparing the uncertainty in UK and Italian politics these days. So we'll go live to Rome, where Giorgia Meloni has also been sworn in as Italy's new Prime Minister. She's the country's first female leader heading its most right-wing government since the Second World War. That's coming up shortly. And of course, investors closely watching how she navigates the energy crisis, inflation, and Italy's mammoth debt. Actually, let's get straight to our bureau chief in Rome, Alessandro Speciale, who joins us. So, Alessandro, what will define Meloni's government right now?
Well, the first thing is that she has wanted to emphasize a line of continuity with the previous government, with Mario Draghi's government, on foreign policy, especially when it comes to Ukraine, despite the misgivings, let's put them this way, of some of her coalition parties like Silvio Berlusconi. You have probably read about the audios where he was actually basically blaming Zelensky for the invasion that Russia conducted against Ukraine. And then also on the European Union, what she will try to do instead is to put a stronger emphasis on defending the national interest at the EU level and also internally, boosting champions, boosting hopefully competitivity and doing the reforms and keeping EU money flowing. It's very complicated with an energy crisis and with the recession coming. And in the next few days, actually tomorrow, we'll hear her speaking in Parliament and see how she wants to tackle all these challenges.
So, Alessandro, exactly what are you expecting her plans to be?
Well, on the first hand, I think she has to finish the budget law that has to be done by the end of the year. There is a little money to be spent, about 8-10 billion euros that are sort of leftovers by the stronger growth that Italy achieved under Draghi. And there is a lot of relief measures for companies, for families, to help them stand the increase in energy prices. This is the first thing that she will have to do. And secondly, she has to prepare for the international commitment. Number one is the renewal on Italy's commitment to support Ukraine, to send arms to Ukraine, which is due at the beginning of next year.
All right, Alessandro, thanks so much. Bloomberg's Rome Bureau Chief, Alessandro Speciale. Now, coming up, we'll have plenty more, of course, from Italy and the UK. Coming up, reading the tea leaves, we'll discuss the mood amongst voters in the UK amid months of turmoil with Associate Director of YouGov, Patrick English. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition of Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get back to Westminster. Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt are contending for leadership of their party and country. Betting markets are one barometer of their chances. Current Sky Bet odds have Sunak as clear favourite. Now, the other place we might look to for some signals are the polls. Mordaunt tweeted this morning that some polls show her to be the likely candidate or the candidate likely to deliver a fresh start. So joining us to discuss the polls, what they tell us and what maybe they don't tell us, is Patrick English. He's Associate Director at YouGov. Patrick, great to have you on the program today. So what did the polls tell us?
Good morning. Yes, well, the polls tell us that Penny Mordaunt certainly might have some room to grow into. She's very much unknown compared to Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak, of course, a very well-known politician, had the furlough scheme, he was Chancellor. Penny Mordaunt less so. So she has room to grow into, but also she has room perhaps to go down. When we look at the favourability ratings...
So this would be in favourability if we were to go to a general election tomorrow?
Exactly, yes. We're looking at favourability here. So the percentage of people that have a favourable opinion minus the percentage that have an unfavourable opinion of the politician in general. Now, Rishi Sunak is just ahead of Penny Mordaunt at the moment. However, as we said, Penny Mordaunt has a lot of room there. A lot of people don't really know who she is or what she stands for, so they're quite uncertain. So she does have room to grow, but at the minute, Rishi Sunak is kind of ahead on that metric.
I mean, it's interesting because we don't really know the policies. I know they both campaigned, of course, in the summer, but we don't really know what they'll be like, either of them going forward. So is this just general, this favourability is what in terms of likability? Is it policies in the past? And in terms of, like, how, you know, what are people thinking out when they give you your polls?
Yes, so I think it's very much that. It's a general sense of how favourable, how much they like the politician versus how much they dislike. Right. And that can be a number of judgments. It can be policies in the past, it can be platforms they put forward, it could be policies that they've been involved in or have endorsed, or people around them. Sort of, you might think if Boris Johnson goes over to Penny Mordaunt, that might actually cost her in terms of the court of public opinion, because Boris Johnson is not a very popular politician. No. So there's a lot of things that feed into that. And right now, as you say, Rishi Sunak is probably just ahead, but there's room to grow for Mordaunt.
I mean, do you have a poll for the Tory party, and is it different, you know, for the Tory party as a whole compared to some of these leaders?
Yeah, well, certainly when we asked the party membership earlier last week who they would prefer to come in as leader, it was Boris Johnson who came in top of that poll with a third of the party backing him. Rishi Sunak was not too far behind on 25%. Yeah. And earlier as well in the same poll, we asked if you had the chance to vote again for Truss or Sunak. We found that Sunak was way ahead of Truss. So certainly there was a lot of buyer's remorse around the Conservative Party, and they might be looking at Rishi Sunak now and saying, well, you've probably been proven right around the economic arguments, so maybe it's time that we give you a go.
What's the Labour Party doing?
So the Labour Party right now isn't doing too much, and it really doesn't have to, because right now if you go to the public and ask them what they want a general election and they want a Labour government. But as far as we know, to the best of our knowledge, they're going to get neither. So the Labour Party probably has a challenge now of convincing the public, reassuring the public that they are safe, they have a reassuring plan to deal with the cost of living crisis.
Patrick, what I find amazing, and I saw in certain polls, for example, they had the SNP as the real opposition. If there was election tomorrow, like how volatile polls like that, given the chaos that we saw over the last 47 days.
They're extremely volatile, and one of the reasons for that is that most of these headline vote intention figures are driven by significant portions of 2019 Conservative Party voters telling us that they either don't know who they would vote for in an election tomorrow, or they simply would not vote. So that's a big chunk of the volatility there. If they all went back to the Conservatives, or even a significant chunk of them went back, then the Conservatives would be doing much, much better than those headline figures would be suggesting. And of course, it's mid-term. It's an unpopular government with the most historically unpopular leader we've ever recorded. So we're going to see some big gaps, I think, and we should expect them to close as the Parliament draws to a close as well.
I mean, have you had to change some of your polling metrics, compared to last time? I know that there's been a lot of pressure on a lot of the polling since Brexit. Do you do things differently now?
We are constantly always looking at ways to improve our polls. So we're testing against benchmarks. Yeah. We're looking to see if we can correctly predict election results. We're bringing in new data when we have it from census or sort of a population survey. So we're always looking for new methods, always testing things out. So yes, we're very confident that we've been improving over the last few years.
How many people want a general election now? More than 70%?
It's around 70%. So depending on how you ask the question, what you do with your don't knows or uncertains, somewhere between 60 to 70% of the public say they want a general election now. And that includes significant proportions of Conservative voters from the last election as well. So it's not just opposition supporters who want an election. It's a lot of people who voted for this government last time around.
How volatile do you expect these polls to be as we get into one of the worst cost of living crises in recent memory?
I think there's room for it to go either way, right? As you say, the cost of living crisis is not going to get better in the short term, it's going to get worse. People are going to find that they have even less money to pay the bills coming through their doors. So that could lead to an even bigger Labour lead. The Conservatives could go further behind, particularly if whoever comes into the power in the Conservative Party, be it Sunak or Mordaunt, doesn't reassure the public that they have a plan for the cost of living crisis. However, let's say for argument's sake that they do. Rishi Sunak, for instance, might come in with a good plan that is popular and seems to do something with the markets and with people's bills. Perhaps then we see that close up. So there's a lot of volatility volatility, and it could go either way at this moment in time, I think.
Patrick, do you have a poll showing whether the Chancellor is popular at the moment?
The Chancellor is okay in terms of favourability. It's not too bad. What we tend to find is that politicians get quite unpopular the longer they're in office, and when they drift out, the public kind of get to grips with them a little bit more and say, OK, maybe he weren't so bad. So he's gone up, but he's still, listen, no one in British politics right now is super popular. Even Keir Starmer bounces around the 0 mark in terms of net favourability. So we can't really point to anybody and say you are a sort of public opinion superstar, and the Chancellor is among that group, unfortunately.
I love that. You're not a public superstar. Patrick, thanks so much, Patrick English there, our superstar here on Public Opinion when it comes to polls, Associate Director of YouGov. Well, Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition continues in the next hour. Matt Miller and Kailey Leinz in New York, Anna Edwards here at Westminster, and this is Bloomberg.
We've seen the power of the markets over the last few weeks. Clearly, what we mustn't do now is anything which signals to the markets more chaos, instability and uncertainty.
We have to keep the rate at a tightening level in order to fully reestablish price stability.
We can be amused, those of us who don't live there, by some of the things that are happening in Britain. But if we think of it is an experience that's entirely outside of any kinds of concerns that other countries could have, that would be a real mistake.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition, with Anna Edwards, Matt Miller, and Kailey Leinz.
It is 5 a.m. in New York, 10 a.m. in London, 5 p.m. in Hong Kong. These are our top stories today. Rishi Sunak edges closer to becoming the UK's next prime minister. Sunak won a key endorsement, and former Prime Minister Boris Johnson pulled out of the race. Chinese stocks haven't fallen this much since the 2008 financial crisis. Investors are reacting negatively to Xi Jinping's decision to fill his leadership ranks with loyalists. And the Japanese yen is falling once again after earlier gains were reportedly supported by what seems like a fleeting intervention. That's no bueno. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller with Katie Greifeld here in New York. Anna Edwards with us out of Westminster. And Anna, it looks like we may have a new prime minister in Rishi Sunak.
It looks like we might do today at some point. That certainly is where the momentum is. He, in the last few hours, has been gaining momentum, gaining supporters. Remember, you need 100 MPs from the Conservative Party to get onto the list, and it seems he's got well above that. But the key question now is whether Penny Mordaunt, who is also vying for the position, whether she will get to 100. Her team confident that they have, but not much evidence of that right now. Markets responding then to the potential for a Rishi Sunak prime ministership, buying gilts, buying the pound, expectation of fiscal discipline. We'll see what happens, what develops in the hours ahead. Katie, what do you see in the Asia market session?
Well, it was a much gloomier picture overnight in Asia. As Matt said, you had Chinese President Xi Jinping stack his leadership ranks with loyalists. A lot of fears about what that means for COVID-0 policies, what that means in terms of pressure on state-owned companies, historic losses as a result. You saw the CSI 300 down. But most of that selling came in Chinese tech, the Hang Seng Index taking the brunt of that selling. What that meant for FX markets, too, a lot of pain in terms of the onshore yuan hitting its weakest level against the dollar since 2008. And we should check in on the yen as well. You can see we're edging up back towards 150. The yen had surged against the dollar on reports Friday about BOJ intervention. Like Matt said, it looks like those gains are short-lived, though, and all of this coming before the BOJ meets later this week.
All right, now let's take a look at what's going on in terms of U.S. markets. You saw it a little bit there with Katie. Excellently handled, by the way, until we switch back over to the Asia board. U.S. futures down 0.4%. But what a rally we had last week. I mean, we closed the Friday session out up more than 2%. We closed the week out up more than 4.5%. It's the strongest week that we've had, I think, since July. So real rally last week, it would make sense to let a little bit out, take some profit off the table today. The 10-year yield coming down right now, and we're seeing this with yields around the globe. I'm not sure how much of it has to do with the huge moves that we've seen in the UK, but you do have investors buying U.S. debt as well, pretty much all across the curve except for the 2-year right now. The 10-year yielding 4.1981. The Bloomberg Dollar Index coming back up a little bit after going down to 1337. I will say that on Friday, we charged up to an all-time record high on the Bloomberg Dollar Index. We were at 1357. We've been down to 1337. Now we're coming back up a little bit as the dollar gains against most other currencies, with the exception of the pound. Very interesting exception there. And then NYMEX crude coming down a little more than 2%, $83.24. So even after the big cut that OPEC had, I guess we're continuing to see more barrels come out of the SPR, but that's not making a huge difference. It's got to be concern about a global recession and demand falling out that's keeping oil down at these levels. Anna, what do you see in Europe?
Yeah, well, following on from the strength that we saw on Wall Street at the end of last week, Matt, we have been trying to make gains here in Europe, despite some disappointing economic data coming out of the Eurozone. We've got PMIs that disappointed across the Eurozone, below 50 on services, on manufacturing, and on the composite number. Despite that, managing to make some gains, not as strong as the gains were earlier on, responding a little bit to the nervousness coming out of the Chinese market post the party congress taking place there. But that's what we have on the European equity markets then, a positive picture, apart from notably the UK, where perhaps the FX market effect is weighing on large cap stocks. This is what we have on FX markets. The pound over that 113 mark at 113.20, rallying a little. It rallied in the latter part of yesterday's session as well, after, as we heard from Boris Johnson, that he's not going to stand, and as the market increasingly positions itself around the expectation of a Rishi Sunak win. We're also seeing buying of gilts. You can see that at the 2-year horizon and those yields coming off. We put Prosus in the chart as well. This tech business listed over in the Netherlands, down by 12.9%. This is a Tencent effect. It has a stake in Tencent over in China, and so there's read across from the Chinese equity session into what's going on in Prosus and therefore in the Netherlands. And Philips down by 2.8%. This company, medical devices business, of course, these days, cutting 4,000 jobs under a new CEO. They've been recalling products and around sleep apnea. So there's some specifics around Philips, but you have to wonder how much this micro relates to the macro and broader concerns around the Eurozone economy. Well, let's go from the Eurozone to concerns around the UK economy and what a new Prime Minister can do about that. Rishi Sunak took a huge step toward becoming the UK's next Prime Minister after Chancellor Jeremy Hunt endorsed him and former Premier Boris Johnson pulled out of the contest. Joe Mays, our UK government reporter, joins us now for more. Joe, very good morning to you. And it's not just, yes, he's got the endorsement now of the Chancellor, which matters, but also some prominent Boris Johnson supporters have now moved from supporting Johnson yesterday to supporting Rishi Sunak this morning.
Yes, former Home Secretary Priti Patel just come out to support Rishi Sunak. James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary. These were big Boris Johnson supporters now backing Sunak. So you're right, he has the momentum going into today. The key question is whether the challenger, Penny Mordaunt, can she get above 100 nominations to contest that ballot this afternoon? Now, Penny Mordaunt's campaign just put out a statement saying she's in it to win it. She's getting the numbers. So we'll see. There's no concession yet. So an exciting few hours ahead
and
to see whether she gets there.
All the media organisations trying to work out how much support she has. It's maybe in the 20s, low 30s, but the team's still confident that she can get 100.
Yes, perhaps behind the scenes she has more private backers, people from the Johnson campaign coming across to her. We will find out in the hours ahead whether that's true.
Matt, jump in.
Why does she not just pull out? I've wondered, especially over the last few hours, as Rishi seems to be gaining real momentum here. Wouldn't it be better for the party to have to be united behind one leader?
I think she's not pulling out because she does genuinely think she could get to 100 backers. And she also knows that should it go to the party membership, which is what would happen if she gets onto that final ballot and they would vote for the result on Friday, she thinks she could win that. So that's why there's still a path to Prime Minister for her, which is why she's staying in the race. But clearly, if she can't get to 100 today, she will concede and she will back Rishi Sunak, and that will get to that party unity that you talk about, Matt.
Bloomberg's Joe Mays, thank you so much. Let's move from UK politics over to what's happening in Asian equity markets. Asian equity markets and really cross-asset. You had China's yuan weaken, and stocks tumbled in Hong Kong to the lowest level since the depths of the 2008 global financial crisis after China's leadership overhaul. This follows last week's Congress, and Xi's closest allies will oversee all of China's top institutions, giving him even more control in his third term than in his first 10 years. We have Bloomberg's John Liu, who covers Greater China, joining us now from Beijing. And John, it seems like a pretty cross-asset, really condemnation of what this could mean. What do you think is worrying markets the most at this point?
So I think what's worrying markets is that Xi Jinping has obviously got the levers of power squarely in his hands, and that will give him more room to pursue the policies he sees best fit. So I think you talked about COVID zero a little bit earlier, but other things such as common prosperity, the sort of populist push to reduce the wealth gap, but which includes potentially more taxes on things like property, on inheritance, on capital gains. Those are not things that the markets want to hear. And obviously also in terms of diplomacy, a more assertive stance that we've seen under Xi, that looks like it will stick, and that potentially raises the possibility of more tensions with the United States.
Yeah, John, it does seem as if tech stocks have taken this pretty badly. Had there been an expectation that perhaps the crackdown on tech, which we've seen over months and months, really, years even in China, whether that there had been an expectation that could have been over and now the market's fearful that it's back?
I think what the markets are worried about is as Xi Jinping gathers power in his own hands, that he will push further on this common prosperity idea, and then that will in turn lead to cracking down on entrepreneurship, on risk-taking, on venture capital, and that will in turn lead to a slower growth, not only for the internet companies that are listed already, but for those that might become listed in the future.
Bloomberg's John Liu, thank you so much for covering it. I know it's been a busy couple of hours for you. Now let's take a look at some of the stocks moving in pre-market trading in the U.S. We have to start with Tesla, of course, cutting the price by 5% of its cars in China, even as it ramps up production at its Shanghai factory. You can see Tesla off about 3% in the pre-market, and that comes down to a Friday deadline for Tesla CEO to close his $44 billion purchase of Twitter or go to court. If we take a look at what Twitter is doing, it was actually edging a little bit higher to the tune of about 1.3%. Of course, this follows a 5% fall on Friday. A lot of that was thanks, of course, to Snap, reporting the slowest quarterly sales growth ever. That's as advertising spending really dries up. You can see Snap's down another 3% or so in pre-market trading after a 28% plunge on Friday, Anna.
Yeah, some big moves there, Katie. Coming up on the programme, we'll get back to the UK politics. Anand Menon joins us, UK and a Changing Europe director. He'll give us his expertise on UK politics, the chances of Rishi Sunak, and what could still happen in this race as we wait for the 2 o'clock deadline UK time. That's in around 4 hours' time. We'll also talk markets with Hans Olsen, Chief Investments Officer at Fiduciary Trust Company. What's his expectation around the Fed and therefore for stocks? What does he make of Chinese politics, Japanese intervention in the currency markets? Probably. We'll talk about all of that. Plus, UBS projects a Swiss exterior of discretion and calm. But rivalries are playing out at the very top. Read more of today's big take story on Bloomberg.com or on the Bloomberg terminal. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Anna Edwards in Westminster in London with Matt Miller and Katie Greifeld in New York. Let's focus in on the UK political story. UK bonds have been surging after Boris Johnson pulled out of the race to become the UK Prime Minister, leaving former Chancellor Rishi Sunak as the clear front-runner. Joining us now for more is Anand Menon, Director of UK in a Changing Europe. And Anand, we find ourselves in a strange situation where it seems possible to say, yes, Rishi Sunak is definitely the front-runner here. There have been more public declarations of support for him, but we could still see Penny Mordaunt get onto the ballot. She could perhaps still get 100. At least her team seems to think so. What do you think of the prospects of each?
Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is it's impossible to know, isn't it? The nature of this ballot, with it being MPs who are the electorate, means that people are very secretive and sometimes, heaven forbid, a little bit duplicitous. So we won't know the numbers until they're announced. As you said, the Mordaunt team seem very, very convinced that they can get to 100. And of course, if she does, then that raises the possibility, at least, that this race continues till Friday and goes to Conservative Party members. We don't know if she'll get to that stage, and if she does get to that stage, whether she will concede on the basis that she doesn't have the support among MPs that Rishi Sunak does, or whether she'll go for broke and push the thing till the end on Friday.
And if we do get Rishi Sunak, markets, of course, are very focused on whether we get fiscal restraint. It's something that he acknowledged was necessary over the summer. Didn't land him the top job then, but seems as if it could be a slightly more palatable message now. We know that much about what he would bring. Would he be able to command the confidence of the party, of the House? Because that does seem something that Penny Mordaunt supporters keep saying, that she would be more of a unifying figure. What do you read into that?
Well, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, there are two big issues about Rishi Sunak and the economy. The first is, remarkably, we just don't know what his plans are. And that's because we're not involved in selecting the next Prime Minister, which means that above and beyond his sort of statement that he's going to fix the UK economy, we don't know what he means. Is he going to raise taxes? Is he going to cut public spending? How is he going to fix the UK economy? We know that he plans to be fiscally prudent in a way that Liz Truss clearly absolutely was not. But above and beyond that, we have no details. And that brings us to the political issue, which is he will be in charge of a Conservative Party that is fundamentally divided over key issues of economic policy. There are some in his party representing those Labour seats that Boris Johnson won, who are in favour of greater investment, who don't want to see ordinary people lumbered by more taxes, who would probably think taxes on the better off is a good idea. And then there are traditional Conservatives who believe just the opposite. Whether or not Rishi Sunak has the political skills to pull that very disparate coalition together, we're going to have to wait and see, but it's going to be very, very hard, I think.
I want to quickly ask about the kind of dirty little details that those of us living outside the UK don't see every day. Sunak has a problem in that he's incredibly wealthy, is that correct? And that a lot of Britons see him as helping to bring down Boris Johnson.
On the first, on his wealth, he certainly ran into trouble before because his wife had non-domicile status for tax purposes. And I think when that came out, it reflected quite badly on him with public opinion. So, yeah, but he's dealt with that now. He's, I think, given up his green card. His wife's given up her non-dom status. So I would be surprised if that were much of an issue for him going forward. This Conservative cabinet is full of people who are pretty wealthy, so I don't think he stands out in that regard. And I can now no longer remember your second question. So
Boris Johnson, apparently, you know, a lot of people, especially in the Conservative Party, give him the credit or blame him for bringing down Boris Johnson as one of the first to give out his resignation.
That is a problem. I mean, there is an anyone but Sunak camp amongst MPs who feel furious with him for, as they see it, being the person who brought down Boris Johnson. I'm not sure he is the person who single-handedly brought down Boris Johnson, but actually the narrative is that he did. And that's problematic because you already have the sight of Conservative MPs saying, if it's Sunak, he'll have no legitimacy and we have to have a general election. Now, at a minimum, that simply provides attack lines for the opposition Labour Party. At a maximum, it speaks of the fact that these people are not going to be supportive and he's going to struggle to carry his measures through Parliament because he only needs 30 or 40 Tory MPs to turn and he will not have that majority.
All right, and thanks so much for joining us. Pleasure having you with us and appreciate your insight. Anna Menon there, Director of UK and a Changing Europe. I want to quickly bring you some breaking news on the Chinese yuan. The offshore yuan has weakened past 7.3 for the first 7.3 to the dollar for the first time ever. Now, this comes amid, as Katie Greifeld was saying earlier, a real cross-asset move to the downside, really showing a disapproval from the market's perspective of the new cabinet that she has put together, made up entirely of, some would say, yes men, but certainly they're all men. No women for the first time in 25 years in the ruling board of the party, and basically allies of Xi, and the market is concerned about this because of a number of policy issues connected to that. So the offshore yuan falling past 7.3 per dollar for the first time ever. We're going to continue to cover this Chinese story as well as the race to become the next UK Prime Minister. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller with Katie Greifeld here in New York and Anna Edwards at Westminster. Now, keeping you up to date with the news from around the world, here's the first word. The U.S., UK, and France are rejecting Russia's allegations that Ukraine is preparing to use a so-called dirty bomb. A statement from the three countries' foreign ministers called Moscow's claims a pretext for escalation. A dirty bomb combines conventional explosives with uranium. Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon reportedly clashed with his executives over the firm's strategy for its consumer banking business. According to the Financial Times, the dispute came before Goldman announced a retreat for the division known as Marcus. Solomon argued that Marcus should offer current accounts in addition to savings products and loans. And Tesla has cut the price of its cars in China by about 5%. That partly reverses price hikes imposed earlier this year. Tesla is facing more competition from Chinese electric vehicle makers such as BYD, which sold a record 200,000 vehicles last month. So, it's very interesting to see Elon Musk Tesla continuing on in China, as are all other businesses, right? And banks continue to court Chinese businesses. We're also seeing bankers continue to court the Crown Prince in the Middle East as they prepare to go to Riyadh. Katie, do you see that? We're going to see the biggest CEOs go to a convention there.
Yeah, pretty huge. I mean, I want to focus on Tesla, though, because it was interesting reading this story when you think about what we got last week in terms of their earnings, their quarterly revenue missing estimates. It's a busy time for Tesla. It's just a busy time in general for Elon Musk, too, as we think about what is going to happen with Twitter, when we can stop talking about this back and forth, Anna.
I feel like we'll be talking about it for a very long time. Even when he's got hold of it, there'll be a lot to talk about. That's about all I can predict with any certainty. Coming up on the programme then, Katie, we'll talk to Hans Olsen, Chief Investments Officer at Fiduciary Trust Company. What does he make of investments in Europe right now? Eurozone PMIs, UK PMIs, all coming in really disappointing this morning. The Eurozone ones all below 50. The investment strategy that he employs as CIO, we'll get into that. Where does he see the Fed heading? Will they move from 75 down to 50? This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. Here's what you need to know. Rishi Sunak edges closer to becoming the UK's next Prime Minister. Sunak won a key endorsement and former Prime Minister Boris Johnson pulled out of the race. Chinese stocks haven't fallen this much since the financial crisis in 2008. Investors are reacting to Xi Jinping's decision to fill his leadership ranks with loyalists. And the Japanese yen is falling again after earlier gains were reportedly supported by a fleeting intervention. I'm Anna Edwards at Westminster in London with Matt Miller and Katie Greifeld in New York. And Matt, the focus here, of course, on the politics. The UK stands out a little different from other European markets today because we're buying the pound, buying gilts, perhaps selling some big name stocks as a result because of expectations of Rishi Sunak at number 10, although that's not certain for another few hours, perhaps.
Yeah, but it does look like you're overcoming to some extent that moron risk premium that we were talking about last week. Let's take a look at what's going on here in the U.S. Speaking of morons, we have the S&P 500 down a little bit more than 0.5%, but what a rally we had on Friday. Absolutely ripping face on the S&P, up 2.7%. And for the week, we were up, I think, 4.6, 4.7%. So it was the strongest week that we've had in terms of moves to the upside for the S&P since July. Just a real rally on a lot of volume. I think 3.6 billion shares on the New York Stock Stock Exchange. So that's that. Obviously, you could take a little bit of profit. A little bit of selling is not unusual after such a rally. The U.S. 10-year yield coming down, and yields are coming down across the curve with the exception of the 2-year yield that's climbing only slightly. I think the spread right now between 2s and 10s is about 28, 29 basis points. Right now, the 10-year yield at 4.1960. And the U.S. dollar index back up a little bit after coming down to 1337. This is the Bloomberg dollar index. We had climbed up to 1357 on Friday, which I thought was an all-time high, an intraday all-time high. But a very good trader wrote into me and said, wait a second, in September we were up to 1361. Okay, but we were close, right? Real dollar strength, and that has come off a little bit where we're climbing back up today against most major currencies except for the pound. NYMEX crude is down about 2%, down at $1.67 a barrel to 83.38. So this could be a tailwind for equities if we get a little bit of turnaround by the time we open up. Katie, what do you see in the pre-market?
Well, if we drill down and look at some of the individual names with the S&P 500 futures lower, I have a lot of red on the screen behind me. We kick off, of course, with Tesla. Busy sort of period for Tesla. Of course, overnight cutting prices of cars in China by 5%. That has the shares lower by about 3.7%. Pre-market. Busy time for Elon Musk, too. Again, we're counting down to that Friday deadline for him to really close that $44 billion deal to buy Twitter or go to court. If you look at what Twitter is doing, it's sort of bucking the trend of other social media stocks. It's higher by about 1.2%. Of course, that follows a 5% fall on Friday, which, of course, was a thanks to Snap. We saw that big pullback in ad spending. That sent Snap shares lower by about 28% on Friday. Losses building now. It'll be interesting to see what the other social media companies report as we get really into the thick of earnings season. I wanted to check in on Schlumberger, off by almost 3%. This company posted its highest profit in 7 years on Friday. But of course, Anna, oil is lower. You have that trickling through into shares of Schlumberger as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Katie. Let's have a look at what's going on. A big picture then across European equity markets. And European stocks managing in aggregate to eke out some gains, up by 0.5%. I mentioned that the London market looked a little weaker, partly to do with a surging pound, though perhaps. I say surging. It was surging. Now it's pretty flat, isn't it? 113.08. We are seeing more appetite for gilts, though, today. We're seeing gilt buying, certainly at the short end of the curve. And those, you can see the yields coming down there. We're at 3.5%. So as the market increasingly moves to price in Rishi Sunak as the next Prime Minister here in the UK. That is not certain. It won't be certain unless Penny Mordaunt fails to get 100 MPs to support her. But as the market increasingly has that expectation, we're unwinding some of that risk premium attached to the pound and attached to gilts over recent weeks. Prosus is in focus. This is a Chinese, has Chinese exposure, this particular business. Tencent is the holding that it has. And so we talked about this one earlier. That stock under considerable pressure. That's the read across from the Chinese session, if you like, into what's going on in Europe. And Philips down by 3.9% today. 4,000 jobs to go. A new CEO really making himself felt, Matt. And I suppose with this business, which has been taking charges relating to recalls for some of its sleep apnea products, you wonder how much of this micro story really reflects something more worrying and has a sort of bigger symbolism about the macro.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are having difficulty sleeping lately, so that makes sense. Let's bring in Hans Olsen, Chief Investment Officer at Fiduciary Trust Company. Hans, let me just first get your take on the general markets as we've seen what a lot of people are thinking looks like a bottom. We had a great rally in U.S. stocks last week, up 4.7% for the week, the strongest we've had since July. Is this just a bear market rally?
I think we are. Well, first of all, good morning, Matt. I think we are in this process of trying to find a bottom in this market, and I think this process is incredibly messy. It's going to take some time. We're not certainly off to the races again. We're going to see a lot of data out this week that will have an impact on the narrative around interest rates, et cetera. But I am confident that we're trying to find a bottom in these markets now, and this is part of the next phase.
You know, a lot of people are talking about the U.S. recession as possibly short and shallow, and it seems to me this may be the new transitory, right? What's your view on how bad it gets for a recession that Bloomberg Economics says now has a 100% chance of happening?
Yeah, that's going to be the big story, right? So, I was looking at the numbers, the expectations for growth both this year and next, and oddly enough, overall consensus numbers for 2023, I think it's something like 1.6% growth for the economy. So if we get a recession, it would. I think the numbers would suggest that it would have to be a mild one. I keep wondering if this is the recession that fails to happen. And this is what we'll see this week, right? We'll get an inkling of this with GDP numbers coming through, which at this point is somewhere between 2 and 3% expected for the quarter. So, if we do get one, I'd have to say it would be more on the mild side based on what we're seeing right now.
Good morning to you, Hans. If I could ask you about your expectations for Europe. We've had Eurozone PMI data that looked disappointing, certainly suggesting contraction, and the UK story continues to deteriorate. On the other hand, the one area of hope, perhaps, is gas prices. That benchmark across Europe continues to come down close to 100 euros a megawatt hour right now. What do you see for the European economy heading into the winter, which many assume will be difficult?
Yeah, well, I think that's the question, is what the weather is going to be in Europe. And so forecasting will be as difficult and mercurial as forecasting the weather. I do think that there's a lot that we just simply don't know right now in Europe. Aside from the politics, we'll have a new administration, a new government in the UK, perhaps today or certainly before the week's out. Number one, we've got a new government in Italy. We have problems. Obviously the war in Ukraine is a massive impact on what's going on in the European markets from the perspective of energy. And then we have winter coming. And so, trying to understand or forecast anything in Europe other than it's going to be a pretty tough winter one way or another, I think that's the only safe thing that we can say at this point. Valuations in those markets are getting better, but where are the catalysts to make the economics better? So remains the open question.
Well, to your point that there's a lot of uncertainty in Europe, we're heading to what could be a very messy winter. And if you look stateside, a potential recession on the way, where do you find safety? When do bonds, for example, become a haven asset again?
Yeah, well, the yields are getting up there, right? And it seems, hopefully, if inflation comes down enough and yields go up enough, they meet somewhere in the middle and you start to get a real yield that is reestablished. And at that point, bonds get incredibly interesting, where you actually don't dissipate purchasing power of your capital if you own them the way that we have over the last several years. I think we're in the process of having that happen. If we look at yields on high yield right now, even yields on investment grade debt, they're getting up to levels now where they're starting to get quite interesting. We're watching for any breaks. So if we see any sort of credit events that causes a rethink of risk pricing in these markets through their spread relative to treasuries, that's when we'll start to really start to get active in these markets. These are certainly on deck for us for the cash that we've raised earlier in the year. And so these markets, I think, will probably be the ones we go to first before we come back to equity markets.
Hans, thank you very much for joining us. Hans Olsen of Fiduciary Trust Company. Thank you for getting up early to have this conversation with us here at Bloomberg TV. Coming up on the program, we take a look at crypto's massive C-suite exodus. How much of a challenge is that for crypto? This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller with Katie Greifeld here in New York. Anna Edwards with us out of Westminster. She's on Abingdon Green following the race for UK Prime Minister. Now, I want to talk about something completely different, and that is crypto. It's been almost a year since Bitcoin hit a record of nearly $69,000. Since then, the cryptocurrency has lost some 70% of its value. But even more oddly than that, it hasn't moved at all in weeks. Where does it go from here? This week, the MLive Pulse survey gauged investor sentiment on crypto.
I don't think Bitcoin is the answer to what crypto promises. I think there'll be something that's just like Bitcoin. that is a mechanism of exchange.
For Bitcoin, it's about the macro, but for the rest of crypto, right, the Ethereum ecosystem and all the other, layer 1 and layer 2 blockchains being built and what's built on top of them, that's an inevitable march to starting to change how we actually operate.
I think now that we are in this market, you'll really see the builders come to the fore. And over the next couple of years, we expect a lot of innovation to happen across multiple chains. And we continue to be very, very excited about it.
Our investors recognize and the market recognize that decentralized protocols have unique advantages that not only can benefit crypto markets, but also traditional markets more broadly.
Joining us now is Bloomberg cross-asset reporter Vildana Heinrich. Vildana, thanks so much for coming in early this morning to talk to us about Bitcoin, which it has been since June since Bitcoin has broken out of this range. What's going on?
Or that it's been mired in this range, really,
Yes.
where you have Bitcoin sort of hovering around 20,000, maybe 21,000 on a good day, around 19,000 on a bad day. But it's really just been stuck. And one of the things that a lot of people have been pointing out recently is that the volatility has also dropped, where as we know, we like to make comparisons between crypto and the stock market, where a lot of people are saying it's less volatile than stocks even.
Well, less volatile than any other asset that you cover, right? I mean, bonds have been all over the shop as well. Why is Bitcoin so stable and reliable at these levels?
Well, it's a very good question. I think there isn't a very good definitive answer, except that there's not very many catalysts to help it sort of break out. So just going back to the MLive survey, you have a lot of people expecting it to potentially break out into year end, but possibly to around $25,000, which still is just an immense drop from that $69,000 level that you had just mentioned. And that, I think, has to do a little bit with some of the optimism that we're also seeing in the stock market, where potentially stocks could also have a year-end rally, and we could potentially see crypto also having this like Santa Claus rally.
Well, we need to get through October first.
Yes,
It's been a bit of a bust so far, but okay, so Bitcoin itself.
No one knows what October is.
It just means the line goes
meme.
up. Come on, man. Okay, so we've got stability in the actual price of Bitcoin, but when you look at what's happening in the C-suite, it feels very unstable. We've seen some big headline departures from some of the biggest names in cryptocurrencies in general. Walk us through some of the biggest headlines there, and also how much more upheaval is there left to come?
Well, it seems unstable for watchers like us, for people who are outside of the crypto space. But if you talk to people within crypto, they might say this is actually a very good development. It's a natural ebb and flow, I think, is what one of the investors we spoke to said to us about some of this huge wave of departures, which is, I think, notable for two reasons. One is that we're seeing departures from companies that are very high profile within the crypto space, so within Celsius or FTX US. We had Brett Harrison leaving recently, a huge number of people leaving from crypto lender Genesis. And then the second reason really is just the sheer amount of these, reshuffles, or, sometimes you have the person actually staying within the company, like Michael Saylor, but giving up some sort of title. And so it just makes big waves and makes for big headlines.
And to your point, I've definitely seen it sort of spun that this is a sign that the crypto industry is maturing. And I think that leads in nicely to what we saw out of the MLive Pulse survey, because it seems like most respondents would say that more legal action, more SEC enforcement actions would actually be good for the crypto industry, as unintuitive as that might seem.
Yeah, one person, the way they said it to me, the way they described it to me is that crypto moving out of the Wild West, which is a comparison that a lot of people like to make for the space, and just more, becoming more regulated is actually a good thing for the space, because it might make more retail investors and more institutional investors more interested. Yes, the one very interesting thing out of the MLive survey is that we asked respondents to tell us with one word how they would describe the space, and the number one answer was Ponzi, followed by future. So it really shows the dichotomy between the two, Ponzi versus future, where you have, the true believers and sort of the crypto haters still battling against each other.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, Vildana. When you asked them, to describe the sector in one word, they seem divided then between those who are really convinced and those still remaining to be convinced. And let's remember, I mean, this is a self-selecting audience, I suppose, but they are Bloomberg terminal users, readers of the Markets Live blog, so well-versed in finance, and maybe amongst that community, still quite a skeptical group out there.
Oh, for sure. I think you're always going to have a huge group of skeptics against the space. You just have, again, to go back to that word dichotomy, where you have the really true believers believing that the space is the future, that the blockchain is the future, that there's all these innovations happening within this space that we're going to continue using, in the years ahead, versus those who find it more speculative, where we've seen this huge sell-off in crypto prices, and they say, well, what did you expect with the stock market crashing and the Federal Reserve raising interest rates and liquidity being drained out of the system? It only makes sense to them that we would see, the speculation and froth coming out of the system.
All right, Vildana, thanks very much. Vildana Hajric there talking to us about crypto. Some see it as a Ponzi scheme. Some see it as the future. It could be both, right, in this postmodern age. Tune in to Bloomberg Crypto every Tuesday at 1 p.m. New York time, 6 p.m. in London. Our weekly show covers the people, transaction, and technology shaping the world of decentralized finance. And we often have Vildana on the program. Tomorrow we're going to speak with Ripple CEO Brad Garlinghouse. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Katie Greifeld with Matt Miller in New York and Anna Edwards at Westminster. Now look at what's ahead this week. Tech earnings kick off on Tuesday with Microsoft and Alphabet reporting. European bank earnings also kick off on Tuesday, and that's ahead of the ECB rate decision on Thursday. We'll also get U.S. GDP data on Thursday as well. And the judge in Elon Musk's deal with Twitter has set Friday as the deadline for the deal to get done. Let's turn our attention now to the yen, though. Our markets reporter Valerie Teitel joins us now for the big question. Does the FX intervention mean that the BOJ is more or less likely to break on yield curve control this week?
Yes, Katie, that is the big question I think markets are grappling with. We've seen huge, unprecedented FX intervention from the Bank of Japan. Now, it's just incredible to wrap your mind around it. They could have spent up to $50 billion in the last month doing so. We know, for instance, on September 22nd, they spent $20 billion. They admitted that. And the intervention on Friday, I couldn't keep my eyes off the screen. It was incredible. We had $74 billion of volume go through that afternoon. And there's speculation, the FT is reporting, that the intervention could have been up to $30 billion. Now, the pace of this is astounding, and it begs questions. Is this going to actually strengthen the dollar long term? We have a big central bank who essentially is selling treasuries to fund this intervention. Now, on my next chart, I've got the 3-month FRA spread, which is essentially a measure of funding stress. We know that this has climbed higher increasingly in the last few months, higher than the Russia sanctions levels and reaching COVID levels. Now you have to think, this pace that the Bank of Japan is setting out, they're selling their treasuries, they're basically sucking dollar liquidity out of the system. And this could have ramifications not only from the treasury market, but for the dollar.
Yeah, definitely you could see that causing or exacerbating the dollar shortage that we already see. My question is, what happens when they break on yield curve control, Valerie? Stephen Major was on Surveillance Friday saying maybe now won't be so bad.
I mean, to get your mind wrapped around what it is, the Japan 10-year bond didn't trade last week for 4 straight days, Matt. And we look at the UK's example. We know that they had low rates, low volatility, leverage then built up in the economy. Japan is on another level, right? The low vol, the low rate environment has extended for so long. When they break, the flood of fixed income volatility, the flood of term premium to global bond assets, it's just going to be extraordinary. And it'll need to be handled very delicately because we know that the system at the moment is already quite delicate.
All right, Valerie, thanks so much for joining us. Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel giving us the down low on the Japanese yen yield curve control, the intervention that we saw and the potential size of it. Widespread ramifications, Anna, really could come from what we've seen there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there are some voices suggesting could Friday be the day where we see a move away from yield curve control? I know the team on the right, the Markets Live blog, a bit divided on this. Some say yes, others say no, it's not the right time. It won't happen just yet. That's one big story of this week. Of course, Matt and Katie, also UK politics. We're looking for updates then over the next few hours. We could know today if we have a new UK Prime Minister. It could go to the party membership, but we might know today sometime around 2:30 UK time. That's in a few hours from now. This is Bloomberg.